Greetings. I'm Thomas Caldwell of the Aurelian Column, and this is a special report, the Second Mexican-American War. When most people think of the event that drew the United States into the First World War in 1917, they usually think of the sinking of the ocean liner Lusitania. That was a British passenger ship that was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland in 1915. 1,197 people died in that attack, 128 of whom were Americans. In many history classes, it's explained that that event was what led to the United States declaring war on Germany and the Central Powers in 1917. Wait a second. It took 2 years after the Lusitania went down to go to war over it? That doesn't make any sense, even by the standards of the United States government then or now. No. There was something else that happened. And for that, you can blame Mexico. Have you ever heard of the Zimmermann telegram? Well, it was a proposal made by Germany via encrypted telegram to the Mexican government in January of 1917. It was an offer to help Mexico regain the territories of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which it lost to the United States during the Mexican-American War and in the War of Independence of Texas. The plan was to provide military assistance, weapons, ammunition, and perhaps even troops to distract the United States and prevent it from entering the war in Europe, or at least limiting its participation in the conflict. Unfortunately for the Germans and the Mexicans, British intelligence was able to intercept the telegram, decode it, and turn it over to the Americans. It was made public, and after a great deal of public outrage, 3 months later, the United States sent its sons to die in Europe. This move eventually led to the defeat of Kaiser Wilhelm's government in Germany, and, well, history marched on from there. The telegram gets its name from one Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister at the time, who came clean and admitted the telegram was real after it became public. Mr. Zimmermann had what could best be described as a disastrous diplomatic career. Besides helping in his nation's defeat from the Americans going to war with his country, he had the bright idea of allowing the safe passage of Vladimir Lenin out of his exile in Switzerland and on through Germany and on to Russia, the idea being that Lenin and his gang would overthrow the Russian government and end the war with Germany, thus freeing up military resources so that the Germans could fight the British, French, and Americans on the Western Front with a lot more at their disposal. It sort of worked, but not enough to help prevent Germany's defeat. Lenin's Russia did cease fighting with the Germans, only to end up declaring war on their own people. The reign of terror and horror that followed the rise of the Soviet Union is known to all of us, as are the monstrous crimes committed by Mr. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin. Millions and millions of people who died most horribly over many blood-soaked years, and every German woman between the age of 8 and 80 who suffered beast-like brutality at the hands of Soviet soldiers during and after the fall of Berlin in the Second World War, has Mr. Zimmermann to thank. The man died in 1940 in Berlin. I'm not sure how. Mr. Zimmermann single-handedly caused so much death of so many Europeans, especially his fellow Germans. You have to wonder what his true motives may have been. Now, what does this all have to do with Mexico, the United States, and the present day? Well, quite a bit. In 1917, the Mexican government was still unhappy about losing so much territory to the United States 69 years earlier. And the Germans were looking to exploit this nationalistic feeling for their own purposes. And that feeling, on the part of the Mexican government and the Mexican people, is still there and is now coming again to the forefront. While watching the many Mexican flags that are being flown by protesters in Los Angeles and a growing number of American cities, you're seeing and reading about interviews with people on the streets of Mexican descent, almost always wearing masks, and who are claiming the United States has wrongfully stolen their homeland and that it needs to be taken back. Now, you could put this off to too many radicals, but the problem is the sitting Mexican president agrees with them. Claudia Sheinbaum, the female Mexican president with an untraditional Mexican name for some reason, has called on her countrymen living and working in the United States illegally to protest the arrest and deportation proceedings by the American Immigration and Customs Enforcement Section of the Department of Homeland Security. She has also said she condemns violence and that the Mexican citizens in the United States should respect the rule of law. But if you enter a country illegally, you are by definition a criminal, so that's sort of a contradiction. Ms. Sheinbaum hasn't called for an end to the protests her citizens are participating in a growing number of American cities, and that is quite telling. Another senior Mexican leader is the president of their Senate, one Señor Gerardo Fernandez Noronha. He's calling for an end to the deportation of Mexican citizens from what he is terming their, quote, ancestral lands, unquote. Senior Noronha is also calling for a wall to be built along the U.S.-Mexican border, along the lines of the border that was in place back in 1830. Yes, you got that right. And in spite of people thinking the man was joking, I watched the video of his presentation in front of the Senate of Mexico, and he seemed to be quite serious. In case you're wondering, such a move would outdo Mr. Zimmerman's ambitions many times over. Mexican territory in 1830 included about half the current U.S. landmass, including all of California, Texas, and almost everything up to Colorado. Now, let's look at this carefully. There are tens of millions of Mexican citizens who have invaded the United States over several decades. Invaded. They've come here illegally. A significant portion of them are of military age, have access to weapons of all kinds, are known for being violent, and more than we would like to believe are tied to drug cartels that are considered some of the most violent and bloodthirsty organizations that have come about in recent human history. So we have a standing army of sorts, of invaders from a neighboring country in our midst, currently engaged in increasingly violent altercations against our government, all the time flying the flag of their home nation and calling for the return of their native soil. At the same time, you have the president and other leaders of this country, which is effectively run by murderous criminal gangs, egging them all on, being supportive, and also calling for a return of territory they ceded to the United States some 177 years ago. Does this seem to be a problem? Millions of young men have come into our country without permission, have committed horrible crimes against our citizens, are currently fighting members of law enforcement and our armed forces in the streets of our cities, while waving their nation's flag, calling for the return of their land, and are being egged on by their nation's leaders who are in the back pocket of well-armed, bloodthirsty, criminal billionaires. Hello? Does anyone else see this yet? I'm sorry to have to say it, but at this point, the United States is at war with Mexico. Really. That's the reality. We are now engaged in a second war with Mexico. It hasn't been formally declared yet. The armed forces of our two countries aren't directly engaged yet. But by any reasonable definition, an act of war has been committed against the United States by the Republic of Mexico. Like it or not, desired or not, that's where we're at. Now, to be fair, Americans of Mexican descent have been one of the strongest components of American civilization since the early 1800s, almost back to the beginning. Millions upon millions of Mexican Americans have been hardworking, decent, dedicated people with strong moral values, with more than a significant number of them having served in our armed forces for nearly 2 centuries and continuing to do so with honor. Texans of Hispanic heritage fought and died in the War for Texas independence, and they fought in every military conflict since then. So it's not them who are the problem. But that fact doesn't change the current political realities between the United States and our neighbor to the south. And if it looks like a war, sounds like a war, and feels like a war, it's not a duck. As I record this, U.S. Marines are moving into the city of Los Angeles. More protests are being conducted in several other American cities, and many more are planned for this upcoming weekend. The Mexican flags are flying everywhere across the United States and not flown by people who have the best intentions. But worst of all, elected members of government, especially the mayor of Los Angeles and the governor of California, are siding with invaders coming from a foreign nation who have clearly demonstrated they mean our people harm. What is to become of this? Where is this going to go? It's almost like we're finding ourselves in a dystopian novel or a badly produced Hollywood movie. There's a very small window of time that is closing rapidly for the Trump administration. Unless this rebellion is put down, and that's what it is, unless this rebellion is put down and put down quickly, it will continue to spread. And other states and municipalities will take the same path of rebellion against the federal government that California is currently engaged in. And at that point, we will be in a situation similar but arguably worse than what we saw back in 1861. The difference being millions of hostile young men from foreign countries bent on the downfall of our nation. They were not a factor during the first American Civil War, but they very well could be a major factor in the one that might be about to unfold. The United States has far more enemies than it did in the middle 1800s. And don't expect any of them to be sitting on the sidelines if things continue to get out of hand. That's it for today. If you appreciate my work, please like, subscribe, and share. Share with your friends and share with your enemies within reason. Also, please consider a paid subscription or a donation. It keeps the lights on literally and figuratively. I can be reached at feedback@aureliancolumn.com. That's feedback@aureliancolumn.com. I'm up on X. My handle there is MICCAMPEN. That's MICCAMPEN. This podcast originates at Substack. My handle there is aureliancolumn.substack.com. Until we meet again, be good, be safe, be vigilant, and remember, Clown World and the Deep State must be destroyed, and the governor of California and the mayor of Los Angeles need to be arrested. Good day.